I first got started with Visual Studio, I guess, in 1997. And I was actually working on our web server product, IIS, and Classic ASP back then. And we just shipped kind of IIS-4, which was kind of a big release for our web server. And we're kind of trying to figure out what to do next. At that point, we talked a little bit with Visual Studio, but there was kind of a pretty big gap between what kind of the platform teams were doing and what the tools were doing. And for the web side, we tried to figure out what was next. And the irony was, originally we thought, wow, there's nothing left to do. Everything's been done. And we spent a lot of time talking to customers and realizing there's a lot more to do. You know, things around deployment, the ability to use languages like VB or strongly typed languages, you know, with the web, thinking about security, deployment, configuration, scalability, performance, and then, you know, how do we create kind of a web programming model that enabled you to use kind of controls or UI components in order to help build sites. And so we quickly realized there was a lot of stuff to do. I was one of about two or three people that kind of started prototyping something that became ASP.NET. And you know, part of kind of how .NET and Visual Studio combined was we sort of, a bunch of us kind of came together and realized, hey, there's something big there and a big opportunity. The internet obviously became big, you know, really starting in the 90s, but I'd say really kind of reached a critical point in the middle 90s where, you know, suddenly it went from being kind of, you know, something that people did on college campuses or kind of more the cutting edge people used to something that, you know, most organizations, most companies, you know, started to just say we need, you know, take for granted and make part of their daily life. And likewise on the consumer side, people just sort of started to use the web as an essential part of their lives. And, you know, for us with Visual Studio and especially with .NET, you know, one of the things that we were trying to figure out is, you know, around 96, 97, 98 was this realization that, it sounds trite now, the web was going to be big, and trying to figure out from a developer perspective, you know, how do we make sure that Visual Studio is, you know, the best place to build, you know, rich applications, whether they're line of business based web applications, whether they're websites, or any other type of application out there. And that was some of the genesis behind .NET and Visual Studio.NET, was to basically say we need to kind of radically bring forward, you know, our platform as well as our tools to kind of take advantage of this new world. Well, our first web tool for Visual Studio was something called Visual InterDev that kind of shipped, I think in 1995, and then I think we did an update in 1997. Or 1996 actually, and it was, I'd say, an early tool, and it had lots of really good characteristics of it. But you know, the experience of if you wanted to kind of build web UI, if you wanted to incorporate business logic, if you wanted to go against a database, I'd say it was fairly rough. You know, you could build your web pages using VB script or JavaScript and classic ASP. There are lots of issues in terms of performance, in terms of configuration and deployment. You could, you know, we then said you'd build your business logic in, say, VB through COM, and you could certainly do that, and you go against your database. And you know, a couple of the challenges were every time you actually rebuilt your COM objects, you actually had to stop and restart your web server, and so you manually had to reboot your web server on every compile. Which was obviously a pain. Debugging, you know, the debuggers, you couldn't actually set a breakpoint in your web page and then go into VB and actually step into it. And you know, performance was an issue, and you know, it was early days. And you know, the programming model in general didn't really facilitate kind of a very clean way to separate out some of your business logic or your application logic from your HTML. It was kind of all smushed together. And that was, you know, we kind of realized around 96, 97, it was still very popular because, you know, there was clearly demand for building these types of apps. But it was around that time that we kind of realized, you know, hey, you know, there's maybe an opportunity here for us to go a step beyond and have a much richer tooling experience and really enable you to build kind of applications much easier and much cleaner than people were used to then. At that time, yeah, at that time there weren't that many competitors in the tooling space. You know, a lot of people were, you know, frankly just using text editors and still are today. There definitely were, definitely for us, Java was something that we were kind of worried about. And we certainly saw, at the same time that the internet was getting super popular, kind of a rise in interest in the Java programming language. And this whole, this concept of kind of an object-oriented class library. And so the confluence of the web plus interest in Java as both a language as well as an API, and then also just kind of realizing that there's an opportunity for us to take our languages and our tools to the next level. That kind of crystallized around really around 98, or late 97 and early 98, where we sort of said, what if we could do something that was fairly big and radical, that could kind of bring forward kind of our platform dramatically, and also kind of bring forward our tooling dramatically. And that was really kind of what led to .NET as well as Visual Studio.NET. A lot of people probably assume that .NET started, it was this grand strategy, carefully thought out and had all planned out. And in many ways, .NET started kind of as just a couple of us, trying out ideas. There were 2 or 3 teams in particular that kind of came together nicely. One was the ASP.NET team, or what became the ASP.NET team. It was like 2 or 3 of us at the time. And we were kind of prototyping this idea of how to bring forward kind of our web programming model. And so I kind of over, I think, Christmas 97, between 97 and 98, kind of prototyped the first version of ASP.NET. And it was very simple, and it didn't do everything, and it used COM and JavaScript and C++ and a whole bunch of other things. But get kind of the fundamentals of building a page, having a component model, having kind of a security architecture and pipeline, and a whole bunch of things. And we kind of evolved that and tried a whole bunch of different things kind of throughout 98. In parallel, the Common Language Runtime team was formed around the same time that ASP.NET was getting started, to kind of build kind of a next generation runtime environment. And so it was called the Com+ Runtime to begin with. And we were separate from them. We didn't actually even know each other existed, but they were making progress in terms of defining this thing. And then at the same time, the tools teams had a couple of compiler teams in VB, as well as a language called Cool that became C#, and we're experimenting with kind of new language innovations. And we kind of all came together around 98, where we sort of realized on the ASP.NET side, wow, it'd be really nice to have this object-oriented framework and runtime to build on top of. And the tools guys said, gosh, to do all this language work, we're going to need to have a runtime. And likewise, the tools guys said, wow, if we target this, we can target your web thing. And, well, that would be kind of cool. And it was, I still remember we used to have these kind of weekly meetings, and it was not a big conference room, and it's actually still in our building, but it was, it was maybe we had 20 people in the conference room that represented different teams, and we just kind of would check in on each other and see what each other were doing. And for the first couple of years, it was just those 20 people, and we just sort of report status, and there's lots of things that you take for granted, today when you program, like you can talk to the file system, you can do com interop, you can add 2 numbers together and get a result. And when you're in the early days, like we were with .NET, each of those things was a big milestone when those things finally worked. And so, exceptions was a big deal. Com interop was a huge deal. File I/O was a big deal. And so, that was fun times in the sense of it's hard to imagine where we are today versus where we started, just how much we kind of, how much progress we made. I think one of the things for us that was hard to figure out in the first .NET release was to try to figure out sort of how fast would the Common Language Runtime be. This concept of garbage collection in the mid-90s was fairly radical. And a common assumption back then was no server could do garbage collection. That was something for client apps, not for server apps. And it was true. Most Java servers did not scale very well at all. Part of what we tried to figure out with ASP.NET was how much do we write in C++, how much do we try to write in C#. How do we, how much do we bet on this thing called .NET as we build our own thing? And in the end, we actually bet a lot. We've sort of said at the end of the day, customer apps are going to be probably bigger or represent a bigger part of the code running than the actual framework that we're building. And if we can't make customer apps run fast, then if we can't make our own framework run fast, then customer apps aren't going to run fast either. And so we made this big bet to build ASP.NET almost entirely in C# and managed code. And that was very risky in the beginning. And we'd do perf numbers, and we'd have like, 4 or 5 requests per second for Hello World, and you'd think, God, we're never going to be able to ship this thing. And then, each week we'd kind of optimize and optimize and optimize and optimize, and we'd get up to 10 requests a second, and then 20 requests a second, and then 40 requests a second, and then 100 requests a second was a big time. And eventually we get up to thousands of requests per second. Writing the class libraries and writing things like ASP.NET and C# from a language perspective was wonderful. And so, we love the fact that you could just be so much more productive in a managed language like C# or VB versus say C++. And you could really define the object model in a way that was much cleaner than you could with say COM or traditional C++. The big risk was when you write in managed code, you're running on the CLR. And so the big question was, how good would our code generation be? How good would our garbage collection be? How fast would the code ultimately run? It would look pretty, but how fast would it be to run? And when you're kind of just starting from the beginning and just trying to get memory allocation and code execution working, it's a bit of a gamble. You think we can get the performance to a certain level. You don't know if it will. But thankfully, by writing our core class libraries in managed code, we were able to kind of use them to perf tune the heck out of the CLR and get to the point where it turned out to be a huge payoff for us and really worked out well. Originally, we'd looked at J++ as kind of a clean, then it was based on the Java language, and it was, we liked a lot of the elements of it, and so a lot of us that had started on .NET had some experience with Java, and looked at the language really as a much cleaner way to build object-oriented programming than say C++. And so a lot of us that had written C++ in our day jobs here at Microsoft doing COM, having a clean object-oriented language was just a breath of fresh air. At the same time, there were a lot of things that Java didn't do, even today, but especially back then, things like events, things like properties were a little messy. I think the exception, the way exception languages were declared was a little brittle and a little painful. And so there were definitely things around the Java language also that weren't perfect, but there was enough positives that we said, oh, that's great. The not being able to do J++ because of the lawsuit, it was both a challenge and an opportunity. It was a challenge in the sense that we kind of went, uh-oh, what do we do? And short term was certainly a loss. From an opportunity perspective, it gave us the impetus to do C#. And I think every language builds on previous languages and learns lessons from previous languages. And so C# certainly inherited certain characteristics from Java as a language, as well as C as a language. And I think what Anders did with it was just spectacular, where he then took it to the next level. And I think you can see a lot of the tweaks, as well as a lot of the substantial features that have been added over time. Properties, index properties, delegates, lambdas, link in particular, more recently, and even some of the new dynamic functionality that's coming out as part of Visual Studio 2010. Oh, it's so great that we were able to do that, because it really is a much better language than J++ would have been, and it's really allowed us to kind of, I think, bring programming forward in a very clean way. I think one of the things that's happened over the last really 10 years or even 15 years is, the world and software in general has become, I'd say, more dynamic and more, in some ways, complex, in the sense of the number of requirements that people have in terms of what they want to do for their business has just grown astronomically. At one point it was, hey, I just want to have a simple database and I want 4 or 5 guys to be able to enter data in the database. And then you get to a point where you say, well, I want it to be secure. I want it to be able to work over the internet. I want it to be able to work across multiple field offices. I want to integrate with, Outlook, and I want to be able to do email workflow. I want to be able to do decision workflow so that I can have managers be able to, make decisions without having to write code or without having, this is sort of the requirements for a lot of apps, and the expectations of a lot of apps have just increased, astronomically. If you look at an app today, a web app today, whether it's say MySpace or Facebook or Twitter or Amazon, or pick your favorite app. A lot of us just take for granted certain things. Security should just work. I should be able to bookmark and come back to that application. I should be able to make an order and get it delivered the next day. I should be able to find stuff. I should be able to see relationships between different items. There's a bit of workflow in terms of decision management. It's just basic stuff that we take for granted as consumers. Think back to 10 or 15 years ago. Those were big things. Those things didn't exist in the typical apps. Most companies, 15 years ago didn't actually have an internet connection at all. They didn't necessarily even have email. And so part of what we tried to do was to figure out, how do we build this kind of cohesive framework that handled a lot of those things. And as part of that, it was also figuring out what are all the different teams around the company that are building, things in different silos, and can we find a way that we can put them together so that when you sit down with .NET, there's a common way of doing things, and there's a common framework that you can find things, and then hopefully there's a common tooling experience so that you can, inside Visual Studio, build a client app, a web service app, a database, and so on, all in one place, and ideally be able to stitch together all these different things within your organizations. I think the biggest opportunity we could have missed was to bring forward kind of our what we had in, say, 97 or 96, and kind of bring it forward so that that would have been competitive today. People often talk about the innovator's dilemma, which is you're very successful, you've got a lot of customers, your sales are good, and yet there's a wave coming that partly because you're successful, partly because you have customers, partly because your sales are good, you don't pay attention to or you miss. And I think that would have been the biggest thing for us in the late 90s, was to say, this web thing, maybe it's not really going to pan out. There's not really money in it. Or, hey, this Java language thing, it's cool, but people don't really care about object-oriented concepts. Or, and we see that even today, whether it's test-driven development or trends like that, where it's very easy to say, well, look, our customers are happy. Let's not rock the boat. Let's not add these features. And I think so far we've done a pretty good job in terms of always looking at what are those trends, evaluating them, so you don't constantly chase trends, but trying to make sure that if we think it's a big wave and it's coming, let's steer the boat in the right direction. And let's go after those opportunities, as opposed to saying, hey, we're just happy with what we have right now. It's fairly decentralized inside the org when you go after an opportunity. No one told me, hey, go build this thing .NET. Often as you need more people, you need to coordinate all these things. But we try wherever possible to have individual people in the organization, if they see an opportunity, raise the flag and say, hey, we should be doing this. And get a couple people together and you can start making it happen. And that I think that's kind of something we've tried to promote, and it's been a key part of our success. As you kind of get bigger and as you try to do bolder things, you need to be able to have the new college hire straight out of college be able to say, hey, I think we should go do this. And if you don't have an organization that lets people kind of raise their hand and say, hey, we should go do this, then you have a problem. And that's one thing I'd say in the overall dev tool space that I think we've been fortunate on. I started writing ASP.NET 7 months out of college when I wrote the first prototype. And so, it wasn't some big blessed thing that Bill said go do. It was, hey, we have an idea, I have a weekend, let's go make it happen. I mean, for me personally, one of the things I always focus on is kind of what is the end result, and so, one of the things I think I always try to think about is, as I'm building something, is, what does the end-to-end thing look like? What's the final thing look like? What are all the different components of the final thing? And then what are the steps to get to the final thing? How much code do you need to write? How much, framework support's built in to help you? How do you fall into what's called the pit of success as opposed to the pit of failure? Meaning that the tools and the framework kind of guide you towards the right thing. And so that's usually what I do, is I literally will write out, what does every line of code look like as I'm starting to design something? What are the steps? And then kind of back off and say, okay, to make that happen, what needs to be built? .NET 1.0 was something we kind of unveiled on the world in June of 2000 at the PDC, and it was June or July. It was a big surprise to everyone. a lot of people, I think, went to that PDC thinking they were going to hear more of kind of the same old, same old. And there were definitely a lot of people that were wondering, was Microsoft going to continue to be big in the developer tools business or in the developer business? There was lots of excitement around Java, the internet. I mean, that was a lot of skeptics at that time, and it was fun at the PDC to be able to kind of announce during the keynote what we were doing, and no one had a clue it was coming. And you could almost tell people were like, wow, did they just say this? Did they just say that? And that was one of the highlights for my career, was just watching the audience get into it. And an hour or two into the keynote going, holy cow. And so for that, that was a big highlight. And then we shipped the final release about 18 months later, beginning of 2002. I think with .NET 1, I think you heard a couple of things. One was the early reaction, I'd say amongst the kind of the early leading edge or bleeding edge, was very positive. People were like, wow, I can't believe they did this. And there's a tremendous amount of kind of excitement and buzz and adoption from people that were looking to build web apps, or that were looking to kind of push the boundaries in terms of object-oriented, or who lived in kind of a more object-oriented world and just found that much more natural. And so we had a great uptake from the beginning with .NET 1. At the same time, there were people for whom .NET 1 was didn't have all the features they still needed, and there were folks that the transition to a new thing is never super easy, and so a lot of what we tried to do in 1.1, which was a fairly fast point release, and then especially with .NET 2, was to both keep pushing the platform forward, and then at the same time make sure that we kind of filled in some of the holes or some of the gaps that we had around productivity for certain set of customers that felt like, ooh, moving to .NET's this big thing. I'm not sure I should, I can't do it just this year. And so, a lot of what we did kind of in the following releases was build on top of the .NET 1 success, but also kind of make sure that we in some ways backed up the bus and brought forward the people that didn't make it onto the .NET 1.0 train. And I think with .NET 2 in particular, in VS 2005, we saw another big wave of adoption where we were able to kind of do that. I feel really proud of .NET 1. I mean, anytime you build something new and you have kind of in your mind kind of a vision of where it's going, when you finally get it out, especially a 1.0 product, there's a big sense of accomplishment. Because, again, I think, 1.0 release, people often look at what isn't there. What about this or that? And you take for granted a whole bunch of things. Being at the beginning of .NET where we couldn't read and write from the file system, where we could allocate memory but not free memory. We could do addition but not subtraction. It's things that you kind of just take for granted. Of course you must be able to do that, but someone had to write code to make all that happen. And it takes time to do all those things. And so being at that point where the system was just sort of at the very beginning to actually seeing it ship in a 1.0 release, is super gratifying. I think the biggest thing I wish we'd done in .NET 1 was focus a little bit more on client deployment and kind of the overall experience for setup and install of the runtime. And I think that was probably, in my mind, when I look back and go, ooh, I wish we'd done that differently. We made a lot of progress since then, certainly with Silverlight. A core part of it was, of Silverlight is the fact that install it in 6 or 7 seconds and it's, a 4 meg download. I wish we'd had that with .NET 1, because I think for client deployment in particular, that would have been huge. So that's probably my biggest, I wish we'd done something differently then. But from a feature set perspective, I felt pretty good. Definitely gaps, but there was enough there that I think we could build on top of, and the foundation was ended up being pretty solid. In 2005 was definitely a big release. It was, I think the 2005 and .NET 2 were big releases for a couple reasons. One was, we did bring forward a ton of people that had not made the transition to VS 2002 or 2003 or .NET. Mainly because we helped fill in some of the gaps that existed with some of our frameworks and with some of our tooling stories. And so there was, I think, a big step forward from that perspective. And then obviously with 2005, it also, our whole application lifecycle management suite with VSTS, we brought out for the first time. And that started to take Visual Studio into the enterprise even deeper, and really start to allow companies and development teams to kind of bridge tester and developer and kind of a whole workflow in terms of how you do, whether from bug item tracking to work item tracking to a whole bunch of other things in terms of integrating that experience. And so, that was in some ways still a V1 with 2005, but kind of opened up, I think, .NET into and Visual Studio into a whole bunch of additional spaces and markets. I think the biggest thing in terms of the 2005 release that I wish we'd done differently, personally speaking, was we changed the project file format for web projects in the initial release. And I'd actually gotten decent feedback during the beta, but it turned out to be kind of a pain for people to upgrade. And some people just didn't like the new model. And so one of the things that we did fairly quickly, it was actually even as we were shipping, we actually had a web download, which gave you back the old project format. And then we added it into SP1. And that process was painful for me anyway, in that it required a lot of scrambling to fix. It taught us a good lesson in terms of, one is compatibility is important, and making sure we don't ever underestimate that. And then also in terms of, how do we be agile and make sure we respond to customers so that when they do have a problem, let's try to fix it as quickly as possible. And so in the end, it ended up being mostly okay. And it was a little bit of a speed bump for a few months, but that would be the one thing I would change in the 2005 and 2.0 release. Other than that, it was, I think, pretty good. And we try to make sure that we responded to the pain as quickly as possible and addressed it. So in the end, I think it worked out okay. But yeah, that would be the one thing I would change with that release. When you're trying to evaluate a new feature or a new idea, one of the things that's really important is you get feedback from a lot of people early, and you also make sure that you get feedback from a diverse set of people. And I think where we've stumbled in the past sometimes is if you have too narrow a group, or you sell the idea so well and everyone goes, this is the world's greatest idea, without really kind of asking the hard questions or getting them to ask the hard questions, or finding the skeptics that say, hey, any new idea is a bad idea, convince me, I'm going to ask all these hard questions. If you don't go through that process, you can sometimes find yourself kind of going down a path that either is very narrow or isn't going to work for a certain scenario. And so that's one of the things I always try to push on my teams is make sure you get a lot of feedback. Try to be open and transparent as early as possible with as wide a variety of people as possible, but also make sure that you get lots of focused feedback early from people that will ask hard questions of you, and that helps make a better product. I think all of us that work on the project, when something doesn't go well, take it personally. We think of this as our baby, and so if people don't like a feature, then it's like someone stabbing you. If someone's upset, around quality or because whatever, you didn't ship on a date or it doesn't have this particular thing, it's sort of a slap in the face. So it definitely, you take it personally, and which is good. I mean, it's both bad because it means you don't sleep, but it's good in the sense of we're passionate around the product, and hopefully that passion translates into building a better product. I think the 2008 release was a good release in that it was, it sounds bad, but kind of an incremental release in some ways. And I mean that in a good way, not in a bad way. It just kind of made a lot of things better, and it didn't change the world in a fundamental way, and it didn't try to change the world in a fundamental way. It instead said, hey, let's make web apps better, let's make client apps better, let's make the language features better. Let's enable what we call multi-targeting so that you can target not only 2008 projects, but also target .NET 2, .NET 3, and .NET 3.5. And so it was the first release to kind of have that idea of multi-targeting, which I think is important for enterprises and big companies and small companies. And so it was I think a nice release in that it just made a lot of things better, and didn't fundamentally change the model on people. So in my mind, that was the biggest thing with the 2008 release, was it ended up being a fairly easy upgrade for people to do and to take advantage of a bunch of new features as a result. I think the 2008 release did have a number of pretty fundamental innovations. I think Link in particular from a language perspective, and some of the things that we added around Link, whether it's lambdas or extension methods, I think are pretty profound, and are kind of one of the times when that combined with generics in 2005, where we really kind of took the language innovation beyond what some of our competitors have done, and really opened up some interesting new opportunities. And I think you're seeing that today with us, starting to take advantage of those language features in our frameworks, and you're going to see in the .NET 4 in 2010 release even more usage of that. And I think going forward, that's going to be a differentiator where by having those language features, you can build object models and you can build class frameworks that are a little bit more tuned, that feel a little bit more natural to program to, or a little bit more fluent, and ultimately translate into hopefully developer productivity and make writing code a lot more fun. And I don't mean that in just I'm building a game kind of way, but I mean specifically in terms of, if you're a developer and you spend most of your day writing code, everything you can do to kind of make the experience more pleasurable and less friction-free, or more friction-free, the better. Well, I think the fun thing with the early days of .NET and VS were, the fact that it was such a small group and you knew everyone, and you could fit everyone in one room. I remember the day that we could no longer fit everyone around one table was a big day. It was like, wow, we need to get a bigger conference room. And I think that's the fun thing when you're in the beginning days, where you can often look back, fondly and forget all the bad stuff, but say, wow, I knew every line of code that got checked into the product, and I wrote a lot of the lines of code that got checked into the product. And now the project's bigger. There's a lot more people working on it, and so sometimes you miss the intimacy of I know everyone's code by sight. At the same time, the nice thing about having a little bit more of a mature product and having more people is you can actually do much more stuff, and so the end result with each release gets bigger and hopefully better in substantial ways. And so there's definitely a positive to having a more mature product now. But it's always fun to look back and say, oh, I remember when we debated how exceptions would work. Look how it turned out. Or I'm trying to remember how many times we changed the collection interfaces. I lost track after about 12 or 14 times. And you remember some of those days with fondness. The thing that I think with developer tools and developer platforms in general, a really good one, enables a developer or an organization or a company to kind of build something great that people haven't seen before, and hopefully do it, productively and fast and quick. And I think when you look at how organizations and IT has evolved over the last 10 or 15 years, you look at how the internet's evolved, you look at software in general, it's radically different now than it was 15 years ago. We often, because it moves every year quite a bit, you often lose track of just how seismic the changes have been, pre-internet, post-internet, pre-connected system, post-connected systems. And I think for Visual Studio, hopefully the seed of its success, and then both now and going forward, is if we can enable developers or organizations to be more successful building apps, whether they're web apps, whether they're client apps, whether they're mobile apps, and then more importantly, how they all connect together, that ends up unlocking just a ton of potential. Whether it's, again, you're launching the next startup, or whether you're trying to integrate your CRM system internally within your enterprise or within your organization. If you can make that app 10% better, that can translate into billions of dollars of savings, around the world. And so, that to me is the big potential of Visual Studio. Is how do we keep making it better? How do we make people more successful? How do we enable developers to do more? And I think there's a lot. I think we've done a lot of good stuff. There's a lot more that we can do. One of the things that we're trying to do with Silverlight, kind of like what we did with .NET 1.0 in the early days, where we saw a wave of progress and innovation coming with the web and with the browser and with web-based deployment and software as a service. What we're trying to do with Silverlight is, okay, how do we take .NET, how do we take Visual Studio, and how do we enable people to build apps inside the browser that go beyond what you can do today, whether with media experiences, whether it's with rich internet applications that integrate graphics and data and programmability, whether it's line of business apps, and be able to do it both on the PC as well as on things like devices with mobile, as well as make sure we think hard about running around the internet on different types of systems, both inside and outside the browser. And hopefully with Silverlight, what we're going to enable is the people that already know .NET, that already know C# and VB, that are already comfortable with Visual Studio, to kind of go even further in terms of their solutions and leverage all of those same skills, the same tools, the same APIs, and build even better applications. So I'm pretty excited about Silverlight too.